My wife Kathy and I, much to our surprise in many ways, during the last 16 years have lived in a small indigenous village of Mixtec indigenous people in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico, and have actually become a part of the community in most ways, participating even on a very small scale in public office in the community of San Isidro Yuco, it's called. Yuco in Mixteco means Mount of Bees. And this is in the mountains of what's called the Mixteca Alta, about 2 hours north of the capital city of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. It's a high region. We're at 7,500 feet, a region where agriculture is a very challenging endeavor, extremely poor soils. But over the years, we've learned not only a lot about agriculture and about the genetic richness of the area and of its agricultural history, but we've learned a great deal about what it means to live in community and what the key values that indigenous people of that region have that make community work. I said it was very surprising to us to find ourselves there, and indeed our origins are far, far away from the village of Yuco. I grew up in the suburb of Chicago, a typical suburban young man. Played football and was involved in all the things that suburban people get involved in. And Kathy, with a little bit more of a diverse background, grew up in Fulton, Missouri, in a university setting. Her dad was the dean of the college there, and introduced her to thinking a little bit more widely than we do in most of our suburban atmospheres. And when we got together, I think that's when things actually began to change. We were married in 1963. We saved up some money. I was working in a steel factory in Chicago, and she was working in a hospital in Fulton, Missouri. Saved up a little money, enough money to get ship passage to Spain. And we figured we really wanted to live in a country that was poor, that had a different, perhaps a different perspective on the world than what we were seeing around us. We made the commitment at that time that we weren't going to settle down and look for a house and find a way to rebuild suburban life for ourselves, but naively perhaps, but also significantly, we decided no. What we were after was to find out what the good and the true and the beautiful were in this world, and it's a dangerous project, but it perhaps explains partly why, with lots of curves and lots of detours, we ended up in the village called Yuco, Mount of Bees. We spent a year under fascism in Spain. These were the years of Franco, and saw the corruption that power inevitably seems to create in regimes such as Franco's. We learned a lot. And in spite of the negative things we saw there, we also saw something in the faith of the people that attracted us a great deal, something that they knew that we didn't know, and that was a theme that kept coming back to us. And we came back to the U.S. after a year in Spain, and we're going to get our teaching degrees here at the University of Minnesota. But when we got back, it turned out that it was going to take us 2 years just to do the coursework because of the way the courses were arranged. And we decided that was not what we wanted to do. We started looking for work here in Minneapolis. I applied for a job as a milk truck driver. I always had a soft spot for milk truck drivers since I was a kid, because back then they used to ride around with big chunks of ice in the truck, and the drivers would break off pieces of ice for us kids as we ran behind the truck to cool us off in the summer. But we didn't get any jobs there, and suddenly one night we were looking in the one ads, and there was an ad for French teachers in Saskatchewan, Canada. Well, that was Kathy's field, so I said, call. It said call, collect. And the next day we were on the way to Saskatchewan and lived under what was really socialist Saskatchewan environment. Saskatchewan evidently was the place where the whole idea and the experience of Canada's health plan was born and grew, and an interesting experience after fascist Franco Spain. We finally went back to graduate school in Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and strangely enough, from some perspectives, followed up on what we had observed in Spain among the poor there, and became Catholics. We had read some of the French Renaissance Catholic writers, Jacques Maritain and Léon Blois, and became really interested in being Catholic. We saw something there in the mystical understanding of the world that we hadn't seen in our upbringing, and in a commitment to the poor, to understanding a concept of voluntary poverty, which was totally a mystery to us as we came into the Catholic Church. And then one day Kathy came running from the Northwestern Library with a newspaper in her hand. She said, "This is what we're looking for," and it was actually a copy of the Catholic Worker paper with a Fritz Eichenberg picture of St. Francis and his Lady Poverty on the front. And we were so taken by this that a few months later, after our first child, Eric, was born, we put her in a little box in the back of our old car and drove out to New York to see Dorothy and find out what this was all about. Dorothy told us, well, you know, we need good teachers, go back and become teachers. But we had already set a pattern of rebelling against good counsel and went back and quit the university. This was when Martin Luther King was marching on Pulaski, and joined with the marches of Martin Luther King, moved down to the inner city of Chicago, and along with some friends started a little Catholic Worker house. And after a while, some Franciscan priests and brothers joined us because they wanted to get out of the suburbs and wanted to see what it was like living really among poorer people and in the inner city. And we formed a community called the Gospel Family and opened a St. Joseph's Work Co-op to do the work for which there was no pay, because at that time the neighborhood we were living in was really run down, but there was no money to fix it up, and so the co-op would hire people who needed work to do the work that needed to be done, and charge low rates to the people who needed their windows fixed or whatever it was, and we also asked for donations through the Catholic Worker to help supplement what income came from that kind of work. And we were there for 4 or 5 years in that community, and finally Dorothy would come around, Dorothy Day would come around and say, no, the families need to go to the country. So we started looking. By that time we had 3 kids. We now have 7 and 11 grandkids. But Dorothy would come around and say, no, the families need to go to the country. And indeed it was hard. We couldn't let our kids out on the streets or even in the parks without adults being there. And so eventually some of the Franciscans that we had become community with found a Franciscan monastery that had an old farm that they weren't using anymore, and offered to us to help develop a small organic farm where families could come and where campesinos from Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Latin America who were out of touch and out of place in the city could come for something that was more like what they were used to and more like what they loved. And we were there for about 9 years until we decided we really needed to raise our children in a community that was much more diverse and much more representative of how the human family lives than many communities in places like Wisconsin. And we moved to, after much indecision, moved to a small town in southern New Mexico called Silver City, and began working there with cooperatives and with the Chicano community, and raised 7 kids there. In an atmosphere that had a lot of fascinating things about it. One of the things we refer to a lot is a film that some of the listeners may have seen, and if they haven't, they would find very interesting, is a film called Salt of the Earth. Salt of the Earth was made with the help of directors, Hollywood directors who'd been blackballed under the McCarthy era, and they learned about this strike in Silver City, New Mexico, of all places, and went and helped develop a film called Salt of the Earth about the strike. The strike was the Mexican-American mining community, the miners, striking for equal pay, equal rights. At this point, it was like black and white in the South. It was the segregation, there were separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains. And the miners, the Mexican miners, were striking for equality. And the fascinating thing about the film is that it was blackballed in the U.S. for many years. And in fact, when we got to Silver City in '79, it was still too controversial to show in many places, but it was winning film festival prizes in Paris, and became actually, interestingly enough, a favorite film of the women's movement, because in the film, as in fact happened, the white sheriff put an injunction on the miners, the striking miners, and union members couldn't picket. But because of the macho character of much of Mexican society at that time, the men had not let the women into the union. And so the women took over the strike and won the strike. But when we arrived in '79, still many of the actors were there, and we got involved with the union members and learned a great deal about the dynamics of race as it affected the Mexican Americans and still affects Latin American immigrants and Latin American people who have lived all their lives here in the U.S. So that's part of the journey, but we still had this sense that the Latin people had something really important to teach us that we'd started to learn in Spain, but that was really different in Mexico and Latin America. And finally, when the kids grew up and were on their own, we joined the Marino lay missioners. And they sent us to Oaxaca, and they sent us to the organization with which we still work after 16 years, which is the Center for the Integral Campesino Development of the Mixteca. And after working with this organization, more or less 6 or 7 years, we decided to take the step of moving into an indigenous community there, the community of San Isidro, Yucoyoco. We had no idea how we would be accepted, although we did have some friends from the organization in the village, because we were and still are the only non-indigenous people within about 50, 60 miles. But the community, faithful to the kind of hospitality that we've learned is part of indigenous tradition, accepted us. And we have been able to begin to understand little by little why things are done the way they're done in the community, and what this has to do with the campesino vision of the world, and what it also has to do with the indigenous vision of the world. Little by little, we were beginning to understand over these 16 years that we weren't just living in another country. We were living in another civilization in many ways, and this impressed us more and more. We up here, when we think of civilization, tend to think, well, we're it. There may be some uncivilized areas left in the world, but Western European and American civilization is basically what civilization is about. And little by little, we were realizing that, on the contrary, we were living in a different civilization in terms of its ultimate values, its way of being on this planet. And as we began to realize this, and realize that there were probably very few people who in the U.S. and probably in Europe also, who would have the privilege that we were having of living within this civilization so intimately that we had the chance for their understanding of the world and their wisdom and their way of seeing themselves began to penetrate into us. You know, I was in a meeting of the World Social Forum in Guatemala about 5 or 6 years ago, and I followed what the indigenous people from the Andes were talking about in their sessions, and they were saying some fascinating things. First, they were saying that indigenous people in general today have something really important to say to Western civilization, and they were saying the World Social Forum doesn't even realize this. And one leader said, "We're not craftspeople, and we're not people for picture postcards. We have an important message, but it's very hard for the West to hear us." And he said, and he used these words, which surprised me. He said, "The biggest obstacle to us being heard and the West hearing what we have to say at this time of crisis for Western civilizations, the biggest obstacle is epistemological racism." Now, epistemology, actually they use the word more in Latin than we use it up here, in Spanish in Latin America than we use it up here, but of course epistemology is the study of what is knowledge, what counts as knowledge, and how we have knowledge. And he went on to say, what counts as knowledge, what counts as science, what counts as art in our world today is of white and European origin, and that's why the West has a real hard time hearing us as indigenous people. Well, we had this opportunity in Yuko year after year after year to be a part of a community that actually thought very differently than Western Western European civilization. Ironically, as you think about this, perhaps the greatest purveyors of epistemological racism are our universities. And that has penetrated there. Many Latin American universities do the same thing. And Mexico, for instance, and its institutions still have a great prejudice against indigenous people and indigenous culture. But we began to realize what a privilege it was that we had the ability to, in the invitation finally, to become a part of a different way of thinking about civilization, and a set of different values. Of course, the agricultural system was also fascinating. Oaxaca still has 36 of the 56 to 60 races of native corn that still exist in Mexico, and probably was the center of origin of corn. And the communities still practice a great variety of traditional agricultural practices. The milpa, for instance, and that's one of the reasons that we concentrate on the milpa in the book that we're on a book tour about, called Milpa, From Seed to Salsa. It's a bilingual book. But we concentrate on milpa because milpa gives us the ability to talk about a number of things. And the book was done with the local people there. My friend Jesus Leon and I wrote the text. He's the campesino leader of the organization that we work with. Photography done in all the villages by Judith Hayden of Santa Fe. The recipes are of the local women, and together it's an attempt of the communities of Yuko and surrounding the Mixtec to explain to us, to you and to me and to themselves, what it means to live in a mixed community, how they plant, how they live together, how they celebrate, and their vision of their place in the planet, on this planet Earth. And fascinating that they still use the milpa planting system, which is companion planting of corn, beans, and squash as the initial ecosystem. And within that ecosystem, once that's created, all kinds of wild herbs, edible herbs grow, and the corn, beans, and squash complement one another, with the beans giving nitrogen to the squash and the corn giving a place for the beans to climb, and the squash actually having protecting the soil and building and actually giving off with the rain a substance that controls certain unwanted weeds. A botanical example of mutual aid, of sharing of space, of building higher yields through cooperation and through complementarity instead of competition. And as you can see by the words I'm using, we began to apply that as a metaphor for what was happening in the village in terms of the values of the indigenous village, where there's a term for all the different ways that community happens in this village, and that community is maintained and built. One of those ways, it has a name, it's called Gesa, and that's merely the idea that fundamental to human community is mutual aid, helping one another. Not just because it's nice, although it is, not just because it builds solidarity, as it does, but because it has a huge economic impact also. And when we talk about, how we can build different economies locally, one of the suggestions of the indigenous community is Gesa, mutual aid. We have a type of corn. We go out often to plant the milpa starting in February with a very drought-resistant type of corn, but that is very labor-intensive to plant. And we plant it through Gesa. We go from plot to plot, house to house, a group of people planting together to make the work light, but it also is not just that. Of course, while we're planting, people are sharing the stories of the history of the village, of the personalities of the village that were interesting, of what's happening in the larger village. But at the same time, they're having an enormous economic impact, little by little over the years. People are planting less of this type of drought-resistant corn because it is drought-resistant, because it is labor-intensive. And some people experimented with hiring people to help them, but when you hire people to help, it becomes uneconomical. And so people are going back to Gesa, a way to make an ancient system function, an ancient system of planting function, and to save an ancient strain of seeds that is tremendously important in this semi-arid area by an economic arrangement called Gesa, or mutual aid. the community, little by little, we realized also the community has a very different understanding of the relationship between the community and the individual. The community says, with everything it does, that we as human beings are not isolated individuals and cannot be. And we depend upon the community. And community is our normal way of living. And because of that, we owe something back to the community. And so there's another term called teikyo, which means that every month or so, all the people of the village go out together with their machetes or their tools, and they clean up all the weeds along the road, or they join together to build a small addition to the school. Unpaid work for the community. And of course the economics of it are clear. We don't have to charge, we don't have to have taxes to maintain the community, because most of the maintenance is done by teikyo, based on a very different understanding than we normally have here of the relationship between community and the individual. An interesting sidelight on that is that in these indigenous communities, people, the individual, the person, finds out who he or she is by the set of relationships they have in the community. What I've done for the community, what the community has done for me, what's happened in the community, all this is who I am. This had a number of really interesting consequences that we've learned. One is that we've heard about a number of people say who have migrated to the north, that the biggest shock coming across the U.S. border is for people who have grown up in these villages and have found their identity this way, is after being here a while realizing that who they are is no longer defined by the relationships they have in a community, but it's defined by what they have or don't have. Various people have told us that that's the biggest shock that they had migrating to the United States. There was a study years ago that's interesting on this in El Paso, Texas. They did about a 20-year study and found that most migrants coming across from Mexico actually, on the average, had a higher degree of mental health than the average in the United States. Perhaps very closely related to what we just said about how people in a Mexican village define themselves and find their identity. But the study concluded that after 10 years of being in the United States, the level of mental health of people who had migrated from there lowered to the average level of mental health in the U.S. In any case, we had this great privilege of discovering little by little the values of a civilization that was actually different from what we grew up with and what most of us live with here in terms of its basic values. Another fascinating thing we began to observe is that every village has a fiesta every year. And the villages are close together, so virtually every week or two you could walk to a fiesta from San Isidro, Yucoyoco. But the fiesta is its music and its food and its dance, but it also serves the function of people coming together and overcoming all the divisions and all the difficulties they might have had during during the years and saying together, we want to be community once again this year, in spite of everything. It has an amazing function in building solidarity and reaffirming community. It also has a serious economic side to it. There's a phenomenon called mayordomías. People who have done well during the year actually vie with one another to be mayordomos, which means to take responsibility for a part of the fiesta or the whole fiesta. And so the mayordomo will actually often put up a large tent and invite everybody from the area, and during 3 days of fiesta offer free food and drink, free beer to anybody who comes. Not only is it a great builder of solidarity, but it's a great it's a great economic leveling mechanism. That those who had done well share back with the rest of the community, and all these things, little by little, we began to understand how significant they are and how different they are from many of the things many of the ways of seeing things that we have here, and that are actually becoming more and more dominant in recent years here in the North, particularly in the U.S. As our politicians and our authorities begin to speak clearly the disrespect they have for one another, and as we absorb more and more the vision that we are what we have. We are what we have. Little by little, we realized that what people were teaching us there, we needed to try to share in some way, whether to those who were interested, to those who weren't interested, if necessary. And so we actually, a couple years ago, wrote a book called The Other Game, referring to the way the indigenous communities lived life and saw the purpose of life. And then this last one, bilingual book, Milpa from Seed to Salsa, is the people themselves talking about what's important in their vision of civilization and their way of living together. So now, how we got from suburban Chicago, or even from small town Missouri, to that community and the revelations that it has meant for us, it's hard to say, but that's been perhaps the most striking thing of the last 20-25 years of our lives. And was the rest of it preparing for that? Who knows? we're convinced that the human family didn't survive through hundreds of thousands of years of adversity because of rugged individualism or the market economy. It survived because of mutual aid, because of understanding the relationship between individual and community in such a way that we could act as community. And because we knew how to complement one another, not just compete with one another. And today, as we all know, and only some of us admit, we're in a serious crisis as a civilization. Ecologically, culturally, politically, economically. And one of the reasons we do this book tour, presenting the kind of ideas we've been talking about, is that we're convinced that these values of mutual aid, complementarity, community aid, and a love for the Mother Earth are the values that are going to make it possible for us as a human family to survive these crises and to work our way out of them. The issue of the Mother Earth is a big one. Some of the Latin American countries, Bolivia and Ecuador, for instance, have added to their constitutions the provision that the Mother Earth has rights, legal rights, so that anyone, any Ecuadorian or Bolivian, can go to the national courts and bring a suit in the name of the Mother Earth against abuses of this earth. This sense of the love for the Mother Earth is extremely strong in San Isidro, Yoko. We see it little by little. A year ago, the village decided to straighten the road coming into the village and eliminate one of the bad curves on this gravel road. And so the day before the machines were to arrive, our neighbor Juan said to everybody, yes, we need to do this, but we need first to ask permission of the Mother Earth and ask pardon of the Mother Earth. So the day that the machines were supposed to arrive early in the morning, we all arrived from the village, each bringing some food or drink to the place where the work was supposed to start. And our compadre, Juan, dug a little hole, and each person, starting with the oldest, went up and offered a small sip of the local drink called mezcal into the hole, and said a little prayer asking for success of the project and asking pardon and permission of the Mother Earth for this disturbance. And the first bowl of food was also turned over on the Mother Earth as an offering. And then we all sat down and ate together. And so there's a word in Spanish that's very hard to translate. It's convivir, literally to live together, but it's to spend time, quality time together as a community. And so we would sit down then and convivir, but also convivir with the earth. People there for a long time have known that the earth is a living organism. It's only our own Western society and Western science that has taken so long to realize that. And so the earth must be treated as our mother, and treated as a living being on whom we depend, and who merits respect. All these things are things that we think have a great deal to say to us here in the North in our times, and that's why we do these book presentations. Hopefully they're a time to dialogue together and converse together, and that's why many of them are small groups. We do it with small groups, where there's that chance for interchange, because these things that have taken us so many years to realize, we have to ponder together a bit and wonder about together, and get creative about how we can actually reincorporate many of these things into our own societies. You know, we like to use the image of corn, or the metaphor of corn, to help us think about civilizational values. The corn originated probably in Oaxaca about 10,000 years ago. It originated from a wild plant called teocintle. Oddly enough, teocintle doesn't resemble much modern corn. It has just a little small head, no husk, no cob. And oddly enough, there are no intermediaries that scientists have been able to find between teocintle and the first modern corns, which were very small also, but had cobs and had husks and looked like small versions of modern corn. The indigenous people have a legend of how that happened. They say that the god Quetzalcoatl turned himself into an ant and went into the cave of the gods and stole corn and gave it to the indigenous people, who became people of corn. And we don't have any better explanation at this point of how we got modern corn. But that corn, geneticists tell us that each grain of a native corn has thousands of years of memory in it, genetic memory that hybrid corns don't have. And most of that memory is not expressed at any one time. But in our area, for instance, what these corns are expressing is extreme drought resistance, resistance to poor soils and insects. Of course, one of the big questions in Mexico now is what happens if what gets expressed if those genetically rich seeds get contaminated with genetically modified corn. And so there's a lot of resistance in Mexico against genetically modified seeds. And so far, interesting enough, some successful resistance. But there are all kinds of other genes in those native corns that aren't expressed at any one time. And we wonder whether civilizations or cultures aren't sort of like the corns. That cultures have a genetic history, and that only part of that genetic history is expressed at any one time. And our Western civilization, what are the recessive genes that aren't being expressed? So much of what we see expressed in our times seem to be cultural genes, if we can say it that way, that have to do with acquisitiveness and aggressiveness. More and more we see more aggressiveness in our societies, extreme individualism. Don't these other genes that we see in indigenous communities, don't they exist too in our genetic history? And I think, we believe they probably do. And that one of our responsibilities, one of our challenges at this time in our history in the West is to wake up these recessive cultural genes that have to do with community and solidarity and complementarity and learning how to work as community again. I think it brings up quite a few questions for us here in the West.
The problem that I'm worried about is the problem I think Jesus saw very clearly in the parable of the sower. You can have the seed, but it falls various places. If you were to take a time machine back to your suburb in Chicago and give this speech, I can imagine there are people who would try to change their lives, but I can't imagine that many of them would be successful. In the village where you live, you can live this way, and these concepts can be the guidance of your life, because everything works together to make these concepts make sense. And I'm trying to understand what it means that you come out of that village, you go on a speaking tour, people can pick up your book and say, that's interesting, or even, gee, I wish I were like that. And maybe 1 in 20,000 will pick up and move to Mexico, and become a Mexican citizen, and find a village and fit in. But how are you thinking about yourself as a public actor coming out of your village, coming back to the United States, coming back to the people you grew up with who still inhabit that suburban world?
Well, I think that's the key question here, and I think that really depends upon how creative. We like to pride ourselves as Americans as being very creative. These values, the values of community, the values of mutual aid, the values of a respect for Mother Earth, can be lived in other environments. They don't have to be lived only in a rural village of Mexico. And I think that's where the test of our creativity comes in. Are there ways that we can build back into a neighborhood here in where we are? A new understanding of the relationship between our community and us as individuals, so that we bit by bit regain a balance between our understanding of responsibility and freedom, responsibility to community versus individual freedom. How creative are we in being able to apply those general principles back to a Chicago suburb or a suburb of Minneapolis or any community that we might be part of? How can we, individually and collectively, how can we find ways that mutual aid can be built back into our communities in more effective ways, in terms of solidarity, but also in terms of having an economic effect? That depends on how creative we can begin to be. We're really convinced that these values are values of the human family, not just of indigenous peoples, and that our societies up here have tended to forget these values, but that they've always been there. When we talk in various places, inevitably somebody will come up and say, that's the way we used to do it when we did barn raisings, for instance, or that's the kind of community we used to have when I was growing up. We stimulated a memory by talking about this, of how some of these things actually used to function in our community. We were up in northern Wisconsin this last weekend, and people would come up and say, many of the things you're talking about are why I'm here in this community, because I saw some of those things here that I didn't see in other places. What are the examples of these sorts of things that we can use to stimulate our imagination and our creativity? It's not just an academic issue at this point. We've gotten to the point where we have created societies that are ecologically unsustainable. And so we need to begin to have a different relationship with the Mother Earth, and there are many, many ways to do that if we are creative. We've created a society that is more and more I almost have to use the word brutal, where there's an underlying brutality that is growing, and that we need to address. And that these values give us some suggestions on how to address, but they can't be applied directly and wholly to our society. It depends upon our creativity in doing that. I talk about brutality because what we're seeing in Mexico right now, as a result of the erosion of these very indigenous values, is a terrifying new brutality. Since the U.S. and Mexico started a drug war called the Plan Merida about 8 years ago, based on the kind of analysis of the world that is common in the West, Mexico has become killing field. I don't think you can say it any other way.